By the way, so I was on your website or blog, and I was curious: are you still taking photos, or is that something that's from the past?
I wish. Facebook keeps showing me these, like, you took this picture 7 years ago. Here are 500 likes, and I'm like, I should do this again. And no, my camera has been lying dormant for 5 years now, I think. Just like too busy with
completely, or
yeah, nearly completely. Sometimes I take it out for a friend of mine asks for a CV photograph or something. Sure, I can do you that favor, but no, I haven't been traveling with it. It's a big, it's a backpack, and there's 6 or 7 lenses in there and 2 cameras, so it's also a bit of a commitment to bring my camera in that sense.
Yeah, I'm especially asking because actually not for a long part of my life, but for a few years I actually did quite a lot of photos. And one thing this was mainly also because I was a student and I just had zero money. But I always had one camera and like 1 or 2 lenses at most, which made it easy to, it's like half a rucksack or something.
Yeah, I think the last trip I did was it was Arizona. Between 2 conferences, I had 6 weeks of time. And so I rented a car and I did New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Colorado, California, Nevada.
Landscape then, or just
anything? Yeah, mostly landscape.
Yeah. I mean, I've never been to those areas, but it sounds like you get some pretty good landscape.
It's amazing. I had no idea Arizona was that beautiful. I really did not know that. So brilliant.
Yeah, but is that something like photography? Is that something you did seriously, or there's the different levels of seriousness, right?
Yeah, I was not a professional for sure, but I did have a few exhibitions, and I made some money on the side studying, doing some wedding photography or other things that pay fairly okay. I even got to travel a little because people invited me to, they paid the plane ticket to fly somewhere to do the wedding photography.
Oh, really? That's cool.
Yeah, that was nice.
But it just doesn't, you lost interest, or it just doesn't fit into the other lifestyle
My parents were super supportive in that I could, I played the cello and the piano, and I had, volleyball and table tennis and taekwondo. But at some point you just need to decide what you do. And the same goes for my hobbies. I also used to sing quite a bit. Even after I left Berlin, we used to travel quite a bit and give concerts, and you can't do that and photography and academia and, role playing and board games and being a passionate cook at the same time. That just it doesn't pan out. So I dropped the photography at some point, and I regret it. And maybe I'll pick it up again at some point.
Yeah, the thing that you have to decide on what to do is something that I'm still trying not to learn. That's something I'm still very vehemently trying to, what's the term, rebel against or whatever. Not like in an active way, just doing it and realizing like, oh, this isn't working.
I would say my career is a good example that I haven't learned this lesson either, given the sort of width of the projects we've been doing in the last 3 or 4 years. There's really no specialization anywhere in there. It's quite all over the place.
Actually, that does relate a little bit then to one of the questions I actually had for early on, which was, there was a profile written about you, right, in Lancet Psychiatry. Actually, first question, how does that kind of thing happen? Did they just contact you and say, hey, Eiko, we want to write about you? Or
yeah, the journal reached out to me. I think I met the editor as part of a meeting at the Wellcome Foundation in the UK. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure if that's the reason why they reached out to me. I doubt it, but maybe, I don't know. They reached out to me, and they had a professional journalist write that piece for them, so an external person. So making sure that the journal itself has no sort of conflicts or anything like that. And that was quite scary, to be honest, because I'm not used to giving interviews in the first place. And if they happen, they are about my work and not about me as a person. And so in that interview, also the journalist, who was very kind and super professional, asked, about my life and my sort of things that happened before my career and motivations for doing my work. And that not something I commonly get to answer. So that was a bit scary.
Okay. When was that?
1.5 years ago, I think.
1.5 years maybe. Ago. Okay. So you're trained now for doing this podcast.
Yes, I'm perfectly prepared. These 45 minutes have given me all training I require for any further interviews.
Yeah, but it did seem I mean, did they just? I don't know. Is that a common thing to have these profiles written about? Because I can't remember seeing many really. But I also don't really read journals in that way, right? Like I just read the papers, so I don't know.
No, I hold the editor-in-chief in Lancet Psychiatry in really high regard. I think they've been doing some really progressive things in the journal, and yeah, featuring early career researchers and profiles, I think is a very valuable thing to do. Obviously, I greatly benefited from it, so I'm not going to be the one being critical about that. But I think it's a nice idea, featuring sort of more younger folks and their work and their motivations to doing their work. It's a different format, and yeah, you're right, Ben. That's not commonly done, as far as I'm aware.
Okay, cool. So the quote that reminded me. Rather, what you said something that reminded me of the quote, which is about this almost not deciding on a single thing to do, but doing multiple things. The quote is, "His strength lies, he believes, in the breadth of his interests and not so much in the depth of his knowledge in any given area. He makes a point of saying that he's not an expert in any one thing, but he has a knack of translating different ideas and theories across disciplines."
That sounds nicer than I put it. In the interview,
did you just say I don't know what I'm doing, or
I think I said I think the question was what my areas of research are, and I said I'm sort of a clinical psychologist by training, which means I have a research PhD in clinical psychology, but I have no education in seeing patients. I'm not a psychotherapist, which requires very different educations in most countries, at least in Europe. And that I'm also a bit of a methodologist because I worked in methods departments during my 4 years of a postdoc. And so I think I said to the journalist that 4 days of the week I'm neither, and there's this 1 day a week where I think I'm both. And I think he translated that very kindly into that I'm a generalist. There was a grant I applied for maybe 2 years ago, and that was the first grant I really felt comfortable applying for, because the idea was that you hire 5 specialists from 5 areas and you sort of are the bridging node, and you get to ensure that they can talk to each other through you or with you. And I think that's something I could do.
Is that the grant that you then got, the ERC grant? Or is that
no, I ended up not applying for this grant actually in the end due to time constraints. But grants are overwhelming, and I usually feel unqualified to some degree. But this one I felt comfortable about because that's something I can do. I can bridge people's experiences and research areas. Of course, not all of them, but yeah, between clinical psychology and methods, I think, yeah, it's one of the reasons that the tutorial papers we've been writing are quite well cited, I think, because we write them together with specialists from different areas, and then we do some science translation, and it really helps, having struggled with statistics in my PhD as a clinical psychologist, to sort of have an idea what education people have who read these papers and where they come from and what they struggle with. Obviously, I don't know this for everybody, but I know the general concerns, and that helps a little, I think, in translating these things to more non-statistical audiences.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I've tried to learn some maths, and you have some books that, it's this like introduction to maths or something, and the first sentence is, "Let C be a set of blah blah blah," and it's just like, no, this is not how you start for people who don't know what they're doing. Right? I had the same.
I had the same with Bayesian introduction papers. There were quite a few sort of low key. This is a simple introduction, but I was lost in the second or third paragraph already. So I think we can do better. And obviously, there's great intro to Bayesian statistics papers now at this stage. But 2012, 13, 14, when I was trying to understand, I found the sort of easy intro papers not very easy to read myself.
Yeah, that just makes you feel even dumber. It's like, here's the easy introduction. You're like, it's already way too hard. But is let's say, being a generalist, is that something you planned on doing? Or, because if I remember correctly, it said on your CV, for example, that was your bachelor's or master's project already on depression or something?
Yeah.
So it sounds kind of like fairly focused from that angle. But yeah, I'm curious, like whether that kind of just happened or you wanted it to happen, or?
Never given that too much thought, honestly. I'm somebody who is chronically unworried about the future to some degree. Like, it'll work out, and that doesn't mean I don't worry, but I'm generally, don't worry too much about 2 years down the road. So I didn't really plan things too well, I admit. I was really interested in theory of evolution throughout my studies, biology. I still think it's really relevant for psychology as well. I'm thinking about where emotions come from, what purpose they might have served at some point. It's a bit of a difficult area to navigate because not all the research is happening at the most thorough or apolitical level in evolutionary psychology. So maybe we best don't get into this, but that's a sort of general interest that I've always had. And no, I think I try to pick up skills that I need to answer questions I have. And coming out of during my clinical PhD, became pretty obvious to me that I want to work on sort of elements of psychopathology rather than these big diagnostic categories. For example, I wanted to work on symptoms of depression, insomnia, suicidal ideation, sadness, rather than on depression as a big yes-no category that has been criticized so much by folks in our field. But that requires multivariate statistics because all of a sudden you have 10 or 15 dependent variables and not one. And so I think the methods that I taught myself during my PhD were just necessary to answer my questions. And then I went into a postdoc in Belgium in a statistics or a quantitative psychology group because I wanted to pick up those skills to sort of get clinical answers for the data that I was working on. So it's mostly path dependence.
So it's just kind of having a question and following that rather than saying I work in this area or in this field or whatever.
Yeah, that's been the case for me at least, yeah.
So this is now almost something that I find tricky because I think I seem to be doing it somewhat similarly then, that I have like something I'm interested in and I have to figure out like how to do that. And it often leads to then, so the stuff I do relates to, there's some computational neuroscience in there, some kind of behavioral testing, some game theory, lots of different things from people, I mean, in this case also from quite different disciplines. And it can often be, it feels like you have to learn everything. I'm not even sure what my question here is other than help me.
Yeah, I feel you. So the EPS, I wrote a thank you note for receiving a thing not long ago, and I wanted to highlight how challenging it can be to be a generalist sometimes, or there's a degree of generalism, but I think of myself as a sort of generalist. And I feel really dumb very often in conversations with my colleagues because I work with specialists often. I go to conferences that are on psychometrics or clinical psychology or complexity science, and I'm often the least qualified person. Many of my colleagues are psychotherapists. I don't know clinical theories too well. A lot of people in the complexity conferences are physicists or engineers, or I don't know math that well. And so, yeah, I think there's contradictory advice on career paths. I have some colleagues who say, make sure you have this one thing that you want to work on and reject all other invitations and focus on this and become a specialist. I don't know if that's my advice for folks. Certainly, if you are not able to be as privileged as I am and putting a lot of hours into your work, I think I would do more focused work. But I love this job. I have the time. I don't have a family here. I really enjoy working on papers and writing and collaborating and talking to really smart people. And so, given the time I have, I'm happy to work on multiple projects at the same time across different areas. And I think that the trick there is to get help from people who know it better than you, in terms of like who does the stats, who does the theorizing, who don't hesitate to reach out and ask people more qualified than you. That's why I think we should all share our data if we can, because it's ridiculous to assume that you are the most qualified person to analyze your own data. That's kind of weird, though. It's a big world. There are many, many really smart people out there who are probably better than you in statistics and digging into data and so.
Especially if you are really good at getting data, right? It's a complementary skill. I mean, of course, there are people who can do both really well, but yeah, I never thought about it that way. I thought showing data for the kind of obvious purposes of if people want to use it, if they can check it, whatever, all these kind of things. But yeah, it's also true that if you're really good at collecting data, there's probably someone who's better at analyzing it.
Yeah, mental health data there's many experts out there who could find patterns in your data that you might be unable to find, right? That might inform things down the road. I think of this as a two-way process. In the first step, we sort of establish robust phenomena, and then the second step, we try to explain them. And it's not easy to separate these always very clearly, but we're far away from having established all the robust phenomena in clinical psychology that we ought to establish, and sharing data and having people help you or independently from you look into these robust phenomena, trying to see if things replicate, if they can be established before we then explain them. I think that's super valuable.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to, in a second, start talking about the paper. But before that, I just have one last question about your no committee. So when I sent you an email, I invited you, for the listeners, I invited Eiko and said, would you like to be a guest? And Eiko said something to the effect of, I agree to too many interesting things. So I now have a no committee, which has to basically allow you to start something new or something like that. And then a few days later, you got back to me and said, the committee allows me to do your podcast or whatever. So I'm curious, first, what a no committee is, how it works, who's in it. Yeah.
Well, I don't recall where I got the idea from. I'm pretty sure it was Twitter. Apologies to the person who might have told me, and I forgot who you are. Yeah, I read about this idea of involving peers in your decision-making for some of the things that you're really enthusiastic about, but you're not sure if you have the time for. And it's not so much for them, of course, making the decision, you need to do that, but it's for them helping you think through if that's good for your career, what your goal is here. And I have a colleague, and together we are each other's no committee at this moment. Shout out to Pravitha. And sometimes I run ideas by her, and then we deliberate whether that's a good idea or a bad idea.
Okay.
Basically, you play devil's advocate for each other. Do you have time for this? What is it going to bring you? And then for this, I decided that I don't want to do it in my scientific time. I want to do this in my private, personal time, because I think it's valuable to think about these ideas and get your thoughts and feedback and engage with criticism. And I thought that would be, rather than watching 2 Netflix episodes, I'll do this instead, and it'll be a nice experience. So that was our decision in the end.
Now I feel under pressure to compete with Netflix, but I'll try my best. Okay, but so that's. I mean, like the one obvious kind of meta joke you can have about a no committee is that, okay, so now you set up a committee to decide whether you're going to have more meetings, that kind of thing. And so I mentioned this to my supervisor, Christoph Korn, and his first question is like, okay, how many people are in this committee? Like, is this like but okay, so it's more like just in a kind of slightly more formal way.
It's just a WhatsApp message for me. Yeah, exactly. I just call it no committee because I saw that. I thought it's a funny name, but in the end, it's a WhatsApp message with a couple smileys and memes and somebody asking about your motivation to do something and what you get out of it. And in the end, I'm not always clear on these things and motivations, and can be difficult to disentangle. And it's just somebody helping you with sort of figuring out whether that furthers the goals that you have for this particular thing you want to do. I was invited to give a... Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, does it give you an easier way to say no then? Because you can say the committee said no, rather than sometimes. I don't want to do this.
I mean, in the end, everybody will know it's my decision, of course. But yeah, it can give you some peace because somebody takes the time to think something through with you, which is really valuable. I was invited to give a sort of keynote for a conference that isn't really in my area. And it's also sort of locally circumferenced, the conference. So it's in a pretty small setting, and so I was discussing whether that is valuable for me or not with that person, my no committee, and in the end we also decided I'll do it. But there are these the things I go in and I'm not quite sure about, and then I get some feedback. I recommend it, but leave Pravitha alone. She's mine.
Okay, yeah, she's not going to be everyone's no committee. But so what are so this is also, again, all these questions are fairly selfish. So I've already noticed, so I'm in technically now my 3rd year of my PhD out of 4 years of funding. And I've already started some side projects, and then you realize side projects can take up a lot of time. So what are some, with your no committee or even without, what are some, how do you evaluate whether to do something or not? What are some of the decision criteria?
I would ask the other way around. What do you want to achieve with the project? I wouldn't even think about the decision criteria. My first thing would be, why do you want to do that? Because I want a paper. Then you need to evaluate, if you get a paper quickly in this project, is it a constellation of authors, and are the data ready? And, is all of that, will there be trouble down the road with pre-registration? And is it just an invitation to a special issue where the reviewers might not be as harsh? Yeah, go for it. Then you get a paper out of it. But is your goal to learn something, or to, I don't know, make people aware of your presence, or get to meet awesome researchers? Then so evaluate your project based on what you want to achieve would be my recommendation. And it's not straightforward. It's always to disentangle why you actually want to do something, right? I will never forget Marcos Maracos, a clinical psychologist in Munich, whom I had as a sort of clinical psych teacher in my master's, who always said we have multiple competing personality aspects, and in sort of healthy or more healthy folks, these are more integrated than in some folks who have fairly severe mental illness, for example. And the trick is to disentangle, all these different parts. When you can't decide what you want to do, it's not because you don't have multiple opinions. It is because you have multiple opinions, and you need to figure out, which path you follow, if that makes sense.
Yeah, but it sounds like it's very much like, what do you want to get out of it? Why would you be doing this? The good old question, why?
Yeah, and then you sometimes need to admit to yourself, I want to do this because I want to be on a paper that is highly cited. How does that feel? But it's good to know why you want to do this, or why you think you want to do this, and then evaluate whether the project under these constellations will be contributing to your goals in that regard. My supervisor in Löwe, Francis Thürlings, always said if you want to know how long something takes, you multiply the time by 2, and then you go up 1 order of magnitude. So I mean, that's a big number, but things take longer than you think. But I also think that advice on this never helps. You just need to do 10 projects, and you need to see that they all take longer, and then you can learn from that.
Yeah, I find there's some stuff you have to just learn the hard way. I don't know. I mean, maybe there are some people who don't have to do it that way. But in my case, I feel like the funny thing is that I mean, this is a different topic, and I don't want to. I've talked about it before, but I started a PhD once and then quit it, and it was mainly for the topic. But one thing that also I found quite annoying, or not annoying, but that didn't go the way I wanted to do, is that my supervisor was very clear in terms of saying no, this is your project. You do this. You're not going to start with the side projects, right? Because they take up too much time. And at the time I was like, whatever. Now I've done that, and I've noticed, okay, he was just completely right on that. So yeah, at least in this case, I'm not able to learn from someone just telling me I need to not suffer the consequences. That's way too dramatic.
Yeah, but I think you can, as a supervisor, involve your students in that decision-making process, right? I have a graduate student here now who has lots of offers for side project because she's just super statistically skilled. And I have lots of offers for her to do side projects too, because I get asked to do things I don't have the time for, and she would be very suitable for that. But she can't do 30 papers in 4 years. And so together with her, we sit down and we think about whether it's valuable, how much it would postpone other projects. And I think you can involve people in that process if they, in the end, believe your judgment of sort of the time allotment this will take. And it takes more time than you think it does. Yeah. I ended up committing to sort of being the statistics guy on, 24 papers maybe during my postdocs. And it felt amazing that people reached out to me. It felt nice. I had 0 citations and 4 papers, and nobody knew me. And then people wrote me like, "Hey, would you help us analyze the data?" And I was like, "Oh yeah, that sounds awesome." But what happened in the end is that for, I would say, at least half of these papers, I had to considerably rewrite the introduction and the discussion, because people would start drawing causal inferences that didn't follow from what I did in the analyses. And I just couldn't let that go, because I'm on the paper, and I don't want to be on a paper where people draw inferences that don't follow from the data and so forth. And so it ended up being a lot more work, because and then people said, "Yeah, why don't you, help us with putting this the way you want it?" And I was like, "Yeah, I guess you're right. I should do that." But then you end up writing the papers, and I mean, no harm, no foul. I don't regret that, and nobody is drawing sort of inferences that don't follow out of malice. That's, I don't fault my co-authors for this, but it was an experience that told me, like, if you want to be the methods person on a paper, make sure that to know that you're not going to only be the methods person in most cases.
Yeah. And I feel like, for me, it's like two side projects during my PhD, and in a way, though, I feel like I've really learned about different kinds of research. This was maybe coincidence in what I happen to have as these side projects. But for me, doing them and being frustrated by them really clarified what I don't want to do, and therefore made it's nice to, like, especially I'm very easy to, I get, very quickly enthusiastic about something. So if I have a reason not to do something, that's usually very valuable to me. So yeah, I'm really, in a way, it's I think good that I kind of did something and learned that I don't want to do it again.
Yeah, it's learning, right? I have a list of collaborators I sort of just really, really enjoyed working with, no matter what paper we worked on. And so I will also prioritize working with them in the future because it gives me joy. And I wouldn't work on any topic, of course, but they all do work that is related to the work we're doing here. And yeah, they're just people you get along with really well. And to me, that's important for collaborations, because I end up talking to people every day, like late at night or early in the morning, or I don't know. Yeah, it's a lot of people contact in science in collaborations, and then why not work with people you really enjoy working with?
Yep. Okay, should we talk about the paper?
What paper, Ben? What paper?
I don't know. Just any. Let's just pick one at random. Yeah, so you had, I'm not entirely sure how to call this. It's a target article, responses and response to responses. I quite like the format. It doesn't seem to me to be super common. But actually, how did this come about? Is that the same thing? You send it to the journal and say, like, I'd like for people to comment on this? Or, yeah.
Yeah, so there are not many journals in sort of psychology and adjacent areas where you have this format where you write a longer thing in some more detail, and then the journal invites multiple respondents to this, and then you get to write a rejoinder. I mean, it happens in some journals sometimes, but I think only BBS and Psych Inquiry, the second is where I published this paper, have this as a standard format. And I really love this format for contentious papers, opinion papers, broader perspectives papers. And instead of getting reviewers, you get comments basically from people that get published after sort of basic quality checks, of course. And I'm incredibly grateful that this could be published there, because the commentaries obviously made the paper stronger in a sense. It gave the paper more attention. It's a very humbling experience to get commentaries by the very people whose work 10 years ago inspired me to think about all of these things. Yeah, Paul Smaldino, for example, his work has sort of greatly influenced my career trajectory in the last 5 years. And it's humbling to get thoughts of those folks on your own paper.
Mm-hmm. So is it then that you write the article, it gets peer reviewed, then it's kind of a finalized version, and then people get to comment on that? It's still like that, or?
Yeah, I can only comment on this particular process here. I don't know what the general procedure is, but yeah, you send it in, it's quality checked to some degree, to varying degree, I guess, and then it goes out to commentators, and then you get the comments back. There's also some quality control, I'm sure, for the comments, for the commentaries, but I wasn't involved in that. I think I submitted this to BBS first, actually. It was rejected there with an extremely kind, long, detailed response by the editor saying, we just had a paper that was super similar, and it's really a tough call between those two. We can't have two because the topic is too similar. And so I went to Psych Inquiry, and I'm very grateful that the editor took the risk to publish it there. And then you get to write your rejoinder after you see the commentaries. That was the biggest trouble for this paper. I think I wrote the paper over 5 or 6 years. It's my longest sort of project. It was 5 or 6 papers that all went into one in the end, that all merged together in some way, which was nice. And then I think I had 2 or 3 months to write the response, but some of the commentaries were quite late, so it was not. I found it really hard to respond to, 140 manuscript pages in 20 manuscript pages. Yeah, it was difficult. How do you do that? Do you do point by point? Do you pick out larger themes, meaning you have to ignore some things, of course? Yeah, in the end, I chose a few themes and tried to write a paper that can be read standalone, my response. So the idea is that people can just read the standalone response also and get something out of it rather than having had to read my long paper and the 7 commentaries.
Rather than having to read those 100 pages first, yeah. What did I want to say? Oh yeah. So one thing I also find is when reading these papers is that I had the same thing with Postmodino, who I interviewed on the podcast, and it's the same thing there to me. It seems like when reading these articles, it almost feels like I should do 5 years of research first and like work this stuff like into my understanding of science and try out different things and then speak to the person rather than like shortly after reading it. But that's not really feasible. But you know what I mean? It's this kind of thing where you go like, oh yeah, let's see how this works in practice, and how. Yeah, because I think especially with these kind of more meta research things, it's often fairly not easy, but often some things are easier said than done, and then
it's also learning by doing to some degree. Some of the things you read in 2010, and you're like, yeah, I get this. But in 2014, you encounter an obstacle and you're like, oh, I really get it now. I did not get it. Like 2010, I got the gist of it, but I missed the crucial point there because I was just not ready. I didn't know enough about adjacent areas. I often have that when reading up on measurement problems. There was a paper recently on the coordination problem. Kellen, I think, is the first author. It might have been part of the Perspective Special Issue on Theory Formation by Paul Meehl. And the coordination problem is basically if you try to measure something in psychology, a hidden trait, so depression, neuroticism, and you have a rating scale, 1 to 10, some observed measure, it doesn't have to be a linear function between your instrument and the true position of the person on their ability or their score, but that's completely ignored in psychology. Like, you 8 points out of 10 on the depression scale, you're 8 out of 10 depressed, but that inference doesn't follow. There's a function between those, and it's we'd have to live in a very bizarre world where this function is always linear for all psychological traits. Mm-hmm. But I didn't get that. I read up on this 5 years ago. I didn't really understand that problem, and that paper really demonstrated this using thermometers and temperature and so forth. And I was like, oh, now I get it. And maybe in 5 years I'll be like, oh, now I get it.
Yeah. Although I really like that when you reread something and you realize, oh, there's more depth to it than is recognizable at first glance. I think then that's when you've got a really good paper.
Agreed. Yeah.
Yeah, so to talk about the paper a bit more specifically, or maybe can you just give a brief summary, a kind of, I don't know, like a 1 minute abstract or something?
How much time do I have?
Yeah, I know. I mean, I think the general assumption is kind of that people have read it, and then once you've read it, it might be completely wrong.
I think in the paper, so I was frustrated for a long time with interpretation of structural equation models or factor models in the published literature, personality, but mostly clinical psychology, not about authors, not about people, but about some of the inferences across the board. And I've worked in sort of network psychometrics applications to clinical psychology, and I started reviewing a lot of papers, 2015, 16, 17, and I became equally frustrated by some of the inferences that people would draw from these papers that didn't follow, not in a sort of like pointing fingers kind of way, but in a way like I don't know, in this discipline, I have a bit more insight than some other folks who weren't privileged to do a postdoc with Danny Borsboom and sort of be part of the early days of this development and sort of being up to date about the newest R packages and sort of the, really smart people giving talks in Danny's lab group about all the problems of this and so forth. So I think I had a bit of better bird's eye view, and it started frustrating me. And so I wanted to write on this. And the problems I realized at some point after writing multiple drafts for separate papers are kind of the same in both disciplines, the factor analytic literature and the network analytic literature, because in the end, you're just throwing models at data. That's why they're called data models in other areas than psychology. We don't use the term very often, but we use data models to learn something about phenomena. And that's sort of a weird thing because data models can tell you something about data, but phenomena are not data. Phenomena are data and noise, or data and other things that come into play here. And so I became interested in inferences and abductive inference. Brian Haig's work. How do we learn, about theories from data? What are the steps you need to take there? How can data models or statistical models help us with this? What kind of assumptions do you need to bring in to your statistical analyses to then learn something from your data? How do these assumptions look like? And in the end, I wrote a paper on 3 problems that I see. The first is sort of conflating data models and phenomena, or statistical models and theoretical models, if you want. The second, maybe to give you an example, in our field, people often fit network models to data, and then you get sort of a nice picture with a lot of nodes and connections between nodes. And then the idea is that a node that has many, many connections, for example, in clinical psychology, has many connections because it might be a really causally relevant node. It has many sort of, it might influence a lot of other things in the network structure. And if you intervene on this node in a psychotherapeutic process, for example, you could reduce then a lot of other things in this network of that person. But there are, I think, 7 or 8 crucial causal assumptions you need to put into this to make that work, none of which are usually explicated. And it just doesn't follow because we don't even know if a network process generated the data in the first place. It might have been a completely different causal process where, none of this pans out at all. So that's the first point, sort of conflating these 2 worlds. And I think psychology is bad at that, or vulnerable because we use the word model in a very unclear way. I think statistical model and theoretical model are different, and nobody ever taught me that in my education, so I had to learn that the hard way. And I certainly didn't use that term very well in my own work until 2018, I want to say. The second problem is one of I call that latent theories, where people have clear causal views on their data, but they are not explicated, and that leads to problems. Or related when people use statistical models that bring in assumptions, but that's not explicated. And I think in psychology, we all know Crumbus alpha. I think that's a really good example for this problem, where when I submit papers, I'm often asked to report Crumbus alpha for my instrument or my scale. What is sort of the reliability, or statistically speaking, how strongly are all my items correlated with each other? And then sort of a high correlation here means good scale, and low correlation means bad scale. But this only follows, and that's sort of generally accepted. Like editors, reviewers will point out your scale has low, and that's bad. That there's sort of but that only follows under one single causal model out of like 1 million causal models out there. The idea that all the items need to be highly correlated follows from a causal model where you have one common cause, and it causes all your items. And then an item that sort of has a low correlation with the others means it doesn't indicate your common cause very well. You might want to drop that. But there are many other possibilities where our items come from in psychology, including like a very simplistic network model where items cause each other. And then nobody in the world would argue you should drop an item that is sort of not strongly correlated. It doesn't make any sense. And the third point is what I call weak theories. And that's maybe social psychology is a really good example here, where people have made claims, but they're so vague that it's really unclear if the data actually speak to corroborating that claim or rejecting that claim. Paul Meehl has sort of written about this for many decades, and influenced my thinking on this a lot. And so I write about these things and sort of how we can move forward and fix them. That was a very long summary, sorry, but it's a very long paper.
Yeah, I was also surprised how long it took me to read. I thought like, I'll read this in like an hour or two. It's like, nope, it took longer than that.
Apologies, it took me 6 years to write, Ben, have some respect.
It's fine. I'm fine with the compression from 6 years into more than 1 hour, yeah. I mean, so I think maybe we can then later talk a bit more about the individual problems But just a few more kind of more broader things. Maybe first is that I'm assuming you're in this paper, you're just talking about, or you're restricting your examples and your discussion to these factor models and the network models. But this is a more general problem, right? You're using those examples to make a broader point about the way theories are done in psychology, right?
Yeah, in the end, it was a question of how to translate these ideas to an audience, basically. And I figured the network literature has received lots of attention in the last 5, 6, 7 years, and every psychologist has run a PCA or a CFA somewhere down their career, and often without paying much attention to what's happening there and what causal assumptions could be put in or are required to get any causal inference out of the data. And so it was a practical decision to constrain it to these two statistical areas that I also happen to know better than other statistical areas. So I have a bit more authority or whatever to speak to these problems.
Possibly, when you do this in network stuff, people are more likely to listen than if you do this in something you've never published in, right? It's just fairly...
I guess. I mean, just to clarify, a lot of people know a lot more about this than I do. As is clear from our discussion on being a generalist previously, but
Yeah. But
disclaimer.
One thing you mentioned in in what you just said, there was one phrase that I thought about, or that I noticed kind of cropped up in like the entire discussion of the paper, which is something like without paying too much attention to it. And so this is a really general point, but so I was reading the paper and through the 3 problems you listed and everything, and then at some point I thought like the problem here isn't really a lack of understanding theory; it's just thinking clearly about what you're doing. And I was wondering then is this really a problem in terms of not knowing any better, which in some cases definitely is the case. So from Paul Smordino's work, I've definitely learned stuff that I just didn't know before. But a lot of the things you mentioned here to me seems more a problem of taking the time to actually think about what you're doing and understanding the tools you're using.
I'd rephrase in saying having the time rather than taking the time. I don't want to speak to other people, but at our university, at least in certain departments, you need 4 or 5 papers to qualify for a PhD, and that's an informal rule maybe and not written in stone, but that's an expectation raised towards graduate students. And imagine how much stronger papers could be if you write 2 papers through your PhD and you pre-register them, you collect clean data that you can share immediately with others to inform other projects. If you get to have the time to think about all the statistics you want to use, all the assumptions you bring in, if you can bring in collaborators on expert topics from the outside and sort of really think everything through with them. Yeah, I think it's a time constraint problem in academia that we've created to some degree ourselves, and it's kind of hard to dig ourselves out of it again. There's this whole sort of slow science debate that we're having right now. This thought experiment where if you can write 1 paper per year, would it be stronger than your average paper you've written? It would be much stronger in my case, for sure. So yeah, definitely it's a time problem as well, as much as it is a knowledge problem, but a knowledge problem is also a time problem in the end, I think. So
Right. If you had infinite time, you could learn everything. Yeah, but I mean, I'm not obviously accusing anyone of not doing their job properly. That's not what I mean. But there was a point in reading this paper when I just thought, the problem really isn't that people don't know better. It's just that they don't have the time. And then then somehow to me the proposed solution to the problem becomes quite a different one, right? Because then if that really is the underlying fundamental problem, then yes, I contacted you because I found the paper valuable, so I'm not saying this isn't valuable. But if the time constraint really is a problem, then there can be so many papers written about how to do better theory. It's just if people have 2 days to write a paper, then it's not going to get any better.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure. I don't want to speak to others' experiences here. My own experience is that I learned a lot in the last few years on this stuff that I thought I knew. The use of Micah Ramtula and Reid van Bork have written really convincing work on sort of assumptions of factor models and how you can draw best inferences, what causal things you need to bring to the table to sort of get most out of your data. And I've worked with these models for a while and I wasn't aware of that. So I think in part it is understanding. I didn't have any formal stats training. I didn't have any training on theory formation. There's a lot of things I really didn't know. And then there's care or lack of attention to some degree. Jessica Flick and I have written about sort of questionable measurement practices recently. And in that paper, we were urged to distinguish sort of malice or nefarious practices from oversight or lack of attention. But in the end, the impact on the literature is sort of the same. And I don't want to guess why people engage in sort of practice that look a little dubious from the sideline. In that paper, we say if you're transparent about what you're doing, you're helping us already, because it doesn't matter what your motivation is. If it's malice or if you just don't have the time to do something properly. If you're transparent, you help us. You allow us to evaluate what you did, and that's the first important step. It doesn't solve all the problems, but it's necessary, a necessary first step. Yeah. Anyway, so a bit of a
there. One thing I like about the paper is that I think it's very clearly written, but the clarity in writing then and in pulling the problem apart makes it almost seem trivial then. Like it's, like the clearer you describe a problem, the more it seems like, well, why didn't people fix this, right? So in a way, like the way you wrote about it might almost, by writing well about it, lead to me as someone who's not in the field going, well, that's an obvious mistake. Like, why would anyone make this mistake? The one thing I was thinking of here now is the simulation part you have in here when you say, look, this network model and this factor model have the same fit, more or less, but I generated it with this process. But then it seems like a lot of people would run a factor model and say, oh, look, this fits perfectly well, therefore it is a good explanation at least, or in some cases, this is what's happening. But the way you wrote about that makes it seem like very obvious, like, no, you have to question that assumption. But I guess in practice, it's very hard to actually do that.
Yeah, I mean, and you never know why papers are written up the way they are. What are the constraints? Which co-author added what sentence on causal inference in some? And these are the things that stand out to me. Of course, I use a few examples in the paper because we're often told that we're arguing against a straw man here. Nobody really believes this. But if you look at the published literature at large, people say this very explicitly. We've had this for intelligence for 100 years now, where people say, well, subtests of intelligence are correlated, hence there is a true, common cause that has a name. It's somewhere in the universe, and it causes your behavior in these subscores to some degree. Not everybody believes that, but it is a core belief, and I think it's dangerous because it also aligns. Humans have biases. We make things a little simpler in our head. Sometimes we like to categorize, right? We like to put things in boxes. There's tons of work on essentializing of things. We like 5 basic emotions. Right? The idea that there are like a lot of emotions and it's really messy. It's difficult to acknowledge. No, I'm
it's
not
nice
an expert
if you
on
can
this, but
count them on one hand. Makes it a lot easier.
I found it, dude. I had a class on this, and I think I needed to learn 20 basic emotion theories by heart. White guy 1921 said 4 emotions. White guy 1932 said 6 emotions, and sort of it killed all my interest in any of this research to having to learn this by heart. And I thought about Richard Dawkins, who difficult for all sorts of matters, but he once said that, you believe in this God, you believe in everybody who believes in a God doesn't believe in all the other gods. I just go one God further, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
And I thought that's a cute way of defining atheism there. And I had this with these emotion theories. How can you not see that none of these might be true, that it's just a little more complicated than having like X basic emotions? Anyway, I'm getting... Sorry.
No, but I think it relates also to I think it relates, what you just said relates very well to your third problem about weak theories, because if you have, even if it's 10 theories of emotions, right? If they're good theories, you should be able to see which one seems to be most accurate, right? I mean, it seems to me almost like if you can have, 20, 30 theories of emotions, then maybe part of the problem is that no one's really clear about what the theory actually is.
Yeah, or maybe it's a hard problem, of course, in addition to that.
I mean,
so I don't want to go into a domain like emotion research where I have no expertise or little expertise and then sort of trash talk people working there. I know there's some very serious work and people have worked whole careers on establishing theories of emotions. I just mean to say that the stuff I learned in sort of, my bachelor's and master's sounded a little too easy sometimes. And then the question is also what your goal is. Sometimes, and I learned about this while writing my rejoinder. I read, I think, 6 books on theories and models for my rejoinder because I just didn't have that much expertise on the difference of these two and some of the commentators pointed it out. And it was a kind of really busy summer. And I now distinguish sort of a theory as a broad, big, framework, and a model is more like a concrete instantiation of that framework. It's like, I think Baylor Jones called it a bridge between a theory and reality. And there's no harm in psychology to simplify things, to say there are 5 basic emotions. And if you know that isn't true, but it facilitates research, it makes things a little easier to think about, that's super helpful. I don't mind that at all. I don't mind having a diagnosis major depression as useful category, which I think it doesn't turn out to be very useful. But, some categories that aren't true can be really useful. And I think Talia Arconi wrote a commentary to that effect in response to my paper. And I agree with them. We're both, I think, pragmatists in this sense. And so then the question is, what do you want to do? Do you want your theory to be true, or do you want a model that is useful? And they're not necessarily the same thing, and they also ought to be evaluated differently, I think.
Yeah, I mean, that for me was something, for example, that I really learned while reading Paul Smodino's paper, Models Are Stupid. The idea that, like, your model doesn't have to, number one, reflect everything, and number two, be correct. It has to be useful. And
Paul has done really good work on this. I think throughout my rejoinder, I use his idea of a map in a city, a geographical map as a model, where the map needs to be useful for the purpose that you want to navigate the map by. Maybe it's topology. Maybe you want to climb mountains to meet your climbing requirements on your smartwatch. I don't know. Or maybe you want to navigate an easy terrain because you want to take the elderly for a walk. All of that you can get from a map. The question is, what do you want to get from that map? Does it have to be real? No.
Yeah, there's a reason that the London, like, you can't, using, for example, the London tube map to get around by foot is not a great way to get there, but it's a fantastic way to get around by tube.
Exactly. Yeah. I should have used that example in the paper. It's better than my example than I used. So it's geographically inaccurate because it's bent and shaped in weird ways to make it look nice on the map. But it is a very nice way to get around by tube. Indeed.
And sometimes it's even misleading. Like there are, I can't remember which two, Tottenham Court Road and Covent Garden or something, that are 200 meters away from each other or something. And if you look on the map, it looks like, it's a small distance, of course, but like it could be anything. But if you actually live in London, like if you go from one to the other, it's faster to walk. So like in some cases, it can even be misleading. But as a whole, it's super useful to not have this geographical realism in there.
Exactly. It should come with a disclaimer. The map would usually, you could make these maps, of course, with geographical realism, but it would use a lot of its purpose and utility in using it as a metro map.
Yeah, you couldn't like hold it in your palm and see most of the stations. You'd have to have this really big map. Yeah. Yeah. So, okay. So another, maybe I should have said that at the outset, but even though I'd, heard of factor models and network models, I've never used any of this. It's the kind of thing I occasionally come across for 5 seconds. So there's a decent chance that some of my comments here will just be from an uninformed outsider. But one thing that really confused me, or that seemed surprising to me, is that it seems to me, at least some of the examples you gave, a lot of the problems, that seem to me, could be resolved, or at least be made more obvious by having some sort of model comparison. It seemed to me sometimes that people will say, okay, we fit this factor model to it, and it fits very well, therefore it's the underlying fact. But if you'd created lots of other models, for example, the network model and all these kind of things, it would have been much more obvious, I think, that it's just one interpretation of the whole thing and not necessarily the truth just because it fits well. Is that not done, or is it done in a different way, or?
Yeah, so there is this, I'm going to answer trying to give an example. There's this idea that psychopathology is organized hierarchically to some degree, with a P factor for psychopathology on top of everything, and then you have these sort of lower things like externalizing, internalizing, and then you have the disorders under that, and you have the symptoms. And I omitted a few ideas here. I think that's a good idea in general. I think the P factor might be something like an underlying tendency, early risk factors that predispose you to a lot of different problems in life. We know that is true for early adversity. But weirdly enough, in this area, factor models have had sole monopoly. So if you read the, 50 papers or something on this, all of them use a particular type of structural equation model, reflective latent variable models in 3 or 4 different flavors. And I have a paper with Ashley Green and Nick Eaton on this that we published in World Psychiatry just a couple of weeks ago, where we say that it's not a bad idea to fit a factor model to these data sets, but methodological pluralism is important at some point to establish robust phenomena. If the idea really is that we're in the stage of research where we're still trying to establish robust phenomena or data rather than sort of explaining them, and that's why we fit these models that are largely exploratory right now, then fitting one particular type of statistical model out of thousands is probably not going to cut it to establish something robustly. And I don't quite understand why we haven't done this in that area, for example. Maybe there's path dependence. Maybe readers will tell you, yeah, but it's not comparable if you don't do it the same way. Certainly academia is conservative in some regard, right? You try to change something and you get lots of pushback. Yeah. I've recently tried to delete one item from an established depression scale because this item correlates negatively with the other items. So it's really not a good idea to include it. But reviewers treated me as some sort of like leper. Like, how dare you touch this scale from 1960 that everybody knows is written by this saint of depression scales, Hamilton. So yeah, I mean, there are probably good reasons for this, but it's probably not good for science that we have monism of methods in certain areas or certain pockets. Also for network models, like, we should work on developing more network models, and we should are there nonlinear interactions going on between nodes and stuff like that, and pluralism.
Yeah, but it's not routinely done. So, for example, I'm looking at your it doesn't matter what network, what particular network you set up, but is it? So somehow my assumption was that in many of these papers you would, set up all kinds of networks that kind of make sense from different perspectives, and then you just see how they compare against each other. Is that done, or
No, that's not done. For possibly similar reasons. One is papers have figure limits, right? I'm not justifying why my papers don't have more network models than 1 or 2. I have some work where we try to replicate them across different data sets, but even there I will use the same method 4 times in 4 data sets to avoid methods being responsible for differences across data sets. Of course, you want to use the same method there. Could I have used 3 more models with the data? Yeah. So in my early work on this, the methods were not available, but in the last year or two, Sasha Epscombe and others has developed additional types of network models that deal with false positive rates in different ways, or that do the estimation procedures a little differently. And yeah, in we have a recent paper on phobic fears and panics and so forth, where we use all sorts of
Robin or whatever his name is.
No, that's I'm now talking about a paper in Psychological Medicine on 21 phobic fears. It's a network model, like an empirical network model of phobic fears, together with Ken Kendler, who's the first author on that paper. 7,000 people, and we just had lifetime experiences of phobic fears, 21 of them. And in that paper, I fit 3 or 4 different types of network models to the data set. They give us the same result every time. And I report one in the main paper. I report the other 3 in the supplementary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's what I would have assumed, something like that.
Yeah, so of course for factor models, we can do that. The problem here is to some degree that they're all statistically equivalent, of course. In the factor modeling world, for example, you can fit a bifactor model or a correlated factors model or a higher order factor model, or, and they will all give you pretty similar fit, but they all look structurally very different. Like the arrows are drawn different, and you have different levels of hierarchies and so forth. And so all of them are represented well by the data. And then the question is what you can learn from that. But it would help in giving people the sense that, like, if every single factor model paper would next to it have fit a network model, it might have helped with not overinterpreting the arrows in these graphs that are, derived from cross-sectional data. And rather arbitrary. And the same for network models. People wouldn't have overinterpreted central nodes as something we need to intervene on. If you next to that put the graph of a factor model, a sort of common cause model where you have a latent variable, to remind folks that we do not know what generated the data. It might have well been a very different model than the one you're trying to draw inferences from.
Again, I'm not in this field, and I'm at the very beginning of modeling. But what does it tell you if all the models fit equally well? It almost sounds to me like, or just some of, just like the way you sound, it almost sounded to me like, well, it almost doesn't matter what model you fit it to.
No,
it's always
so
going to fit.
What I'm trying to say is that there will be, it's like a regression, right? You can regress A on B, or you can regress B on A. Mm-hmm. That's just the same. And for factor and network models, every factor model has a statistically equivalent network model, and vice versa. They are often quite bizarre. So, I can fit a network model to data, and then I look at the corresponding factor model, and it has 14 factors, and it looks really weird, but it exists, and usually it doesn't look too insane. And just one example, I have an example in the paper. If you have a fully connected network, you get a one-factor model. If you have a one-factor model, you get a fully connected network. That's the easiest case. And these statistical equivalencies are problematic. And they're really well known in the literature. In psychology, people use bifactor models a lot, but bifactor models have the tendency to overfit data, which is known for a long, long time. And they have many equivalencies, can fit different models to that data set with the same fit. Or nearly the same fit anyway. So, but I don't know if it's only a problem in this field. You can look at machine learning, for example, right? Everybody's machine learning these days, but people use one machine learning model. They don't use a neural network and a random forest. Like, at some point you make a choice for a method. You report that. I've yet to see a machine learning paper that uses like 6 different methods and sees whether the predictors converge or something, because that's sort of 5 papers, maybe not one, or maybe it should be one paper. And
that's like part of something I'm thinking about right now too, is because I have like one of the things I'm doing. I have some theory in a very basic model, and it seems to data seems to fit it surprisingly well. Also, in a way that the data does allow for the model to be falsified. But then I'm always thinking like, okay, so like, I could like compare it to like, all these other models, and I could set up like, linear, non-linear, and all this kind of stuff. So this is something I'm really trying to figure out now. Like, is it sensible to put everything you can think of into a paper? I mean, that is obviously an extreme, and the answer is no, don't put everything you can into a paper. I don't know, like, since I've been thinking about my own project, I'm surprised that there aren't more papers that sort of say like, here's the model space the potential models we could have, and we're just going to simulate all of them because like, why not? And see how they fit. But
and if you could write one paper per year, you might want to do that, right?
I mean, that's kind of what I'm going for, but
no, and it's a viable strategy. It would make your results more robust. You would get more insight. You would learn more. You would get more experience fitting models, which can be a fun thing to do and helpful. You get more expertise, but it's just there's time constraints, I think. And also, we communicate in ways that are incredibly outdated. Like, if I submit a paper to a psychiatry journal, I have 3,500 words. Sometimes I'm even limited in my supplementary materials and what format they need to have. And so that is the way I can communicate at that stage, right? Of course, I can put stuff elsewhere. I can put it on my blog or something, but we communicate in sort of chunks of information that are, there's no reason that a paper is not in HTML or some other format these days with interactive graphs on the journal website. It doesn't have to be a PDF, and it doesn't have to be limited to 3,000 words. And I don't know. I guess I hope there'll be some changes to this as well, because then we could make things more robust. There are PDF formats these days, I saw that a year ago, where you can mouse over something and the graphs change. Right? So you can have a PDF that says, we use no error control, and then we also use 2 different types of error control, and you hover over these 2, and correspondingly in the PDF, the figure changes to like, how do the results look like when I do some FDR or some, Bonferroni. There's no reason that, Okay, I'm done with the topic. Sorry. It's so frustrating that I need to write this up in this format. I have 2 figures to communicate my findings. Why not 4? Anyway.
Yeah. I mean, maybe that is one reason why I'm asking these questions right now, is because I'm still in the stage where I haven't had my own idea that I really wanted to do my completely own way and had to then conform that to a paper format. I'm not in that stage really right now. So maybe I'll stop asking those questions once I've realized what it's like to actually write a paper. I'm just not entrenched in the traditions, and I mean, I guess I am by reading papers, right? I've only been able to read what's been published, but I think in my head, I can, it's still much freer than if I'd already published quite a lot.
Yeah, there's some constraints in place, and you can navigate them. For example, we wrote this meta-analysis, and the journal told us, well, we can publish it as a full paper, but you can submit it as a letter with 800 words. But it was a meta-analysis. How do you, And so in the end, we said yes because it was a fancy journal, and we wanted that publication. And we, in the 800 words, we simply link to the full paper on the website, on a website, and we put the full paper online. We wrote it up as sort of an 800-word summary, and there's the hard link in there that'll be there forever. If the internet is still there in 50 years, the link will still be there in 50 years. And people can just read the whole thing. And so you can do these solutions. It's fine.
So the letter's more like an ad for the actual paper.
A gateway for the paper. I mean, It's a standalone thing, but for a meta-analysis, you really have questions. You want to know what, you want at least a flow diagram to see what inclusion criteria and stuff. We didn't have even one figure in the letter. But I mean, in the end, it's also our choice, right? You can publish, there are journals that have no figure limits. You can opt to publish there. It's just that, if you want to get tenure, sometimes there are considerations in place. Still, unfortunately, that you might, want to have 1 or 2 pubs in prestigious journals for outdated reasons.
Yep. Yeah, that's all the stuff I'm aware of, but that's still on the horizon. I'm not thinking about it too much right now, but yeah, we'll see. I don't know. My hope is that there are, more and more of those prestigious journals that are adopting at least some stuff. To me, it seems also like for the kind of stuff I do, Nature Human Behavior would always be a very cool journal, and it fits probably most of the stuff I'm doing, and they're fairly progressive. So there is at least the hope that if I have something that a prestigious journal would want, I could even get it in that format.
I think they have a €10,000 open access fee, but apart from that, it's
it's fine. I'll just pay with my salary.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, we'll see where that comes from. Yeah. Okay, so let's not talk about depressing aspects of institutions or whatever exactly we're talking about.
I mean, to be fair, I know you want to go back to the paper, but just to conclude this, there's been so much progress the last decade. More progress in the last 2 years than ever before. So, yeah, I'm quite hopeful about this overall. There's some negative stuff still, but so much progress happening, and overall I think it's a positive story. What psychology specifically has achieved the last 2 years with registered reports and new journals coming up and so forth. And in the Netherlands, so much open access initiatives here and so much new things and new ideas. There's the Taverne Amendment now that I can upload all my PDFs on my website after half a year, and the journals can't do anything about that. Because it's my work and I get to share it with the public because taxpayers pay my position, and the Netherlands just decided that's a thing now.
But how, actually, I think did you tweet about this a while ago? I think, yeah. I was really surprised that the Netherlands can decide for publishers that might reside in other countries. That's not really how law works, right?
Or not a legal expert on this, but so far the Elsevier has not sued the Netherlands. The most important thing is that the Netherlands has said if you get into trouble, we will be responsible, not you as an individual researcher, and they made that point very convincingly, including the head of the Dutch, I don't know, NIH or something. It's not really medical. There's a Dutch research organization that is very large and funds a lot of research, and the head of that organization said on Twitter, "Yeah, this is our position, and we are willing to defend you in court with this position."
Okay, so that's cool.
that's helpful. And then if Elsevier or Springer wants to sue the Netherlands, they can go ahead. I don't know more about that. I'm no legal expert, but
Elsevier probably has more money than the Netherlands, but yeah, it's still a tall order. Actually, one thing when we were just talking about like progress and these kind of things and open access things, one thing that I found kind of interesting, and I think I read it somewhere. Oh, I can't remember where it is. It's somewhere in your paper. But I think you're citing something by how do you pronounce his name? Borsboom?
Yeah, Borsboom.
I think he might have said that something like pre-registrations are cool, but they're kind of a sign that the field isn't creating strong theories. Because if you had like strong theories that made clear predictions, it would be, right now, I think the thing was like, we don't test the theorists, therefore we need pre-registration.
Yeah, then he has this amazing 2013 piece called Theoretical Amnesia that I really recommend everybody. He's a brilliant writer, and that's just very fun to read. I recommend it. It's a short blog post on the OSF, and he says that theorists are not really trustworthy to some degree because they don't fully tell us what they actually think and believe, and they don't fully write down their theories in a formal way. And that's why we have pre-registration, because we don't fully. It's not about malice, but if you write down your theory in an equation in some way that is entirely clear, and you make clear what is part of your theory and what is part of your auxiliaries, that also need to hold to some degree. You don't need to pre-register. We know what's happening. Right? Of course, in psychology, we also have the issue with what are your stimuli? What are, like all the nitty gritty? Well, how do you measure this and so forth? That can be helpful to nail that down because, and I mean, in my field, in depression clinical trials, companies have been caught switching outcome measures because they find something on some outcome measure, but not on the other outcome measure and so forth, right? And so there's value to nailing people down and like what they will actually do later on, given that there sometimes are financial interests, for example.
That's what I found interesting. So I also thought like what other fields use these kind of clear registrations ahead of time, and the only one I could really, I don't know most sciences, but the only one I could think of was medicine and pharmacology and drug development. And there I thought like, well, it's clear because these people have a financial interest in having a drug work and that kind of stuff. But then again, what is the interest of psychologists then, right? Like why? I mean,
staying in academia, I have many talented friends who could not. Yeah, it's not untrue. We all have conflicts of interest to some degree, even people who have a job because they want more citations and so forth. And the human desire for recognition and rewards and awards and all of these things. So
yeah, I like when people put that in the acknowledgements. Something like, we declare nothing other than that publishing this paper is going to increase our chance for getting tenure or whatever. Okay, so...
Sorry, we got sidetracked talking about open science. It happens when you talk to me sometimes, unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know.
No, that might also have been me. I think I'm... Like my education almost in terms of like during my PhD it seems to me the first 2 years, I was really reading a lot about open science, pre-registering my experiments, now learning to upload my code and all this kind of stuff, right? And it seems like after about a year and a half or something of that, I went like, yeah, but something's still missing. And then I came across like, not your paper, but these kind of papers, that the theory part is actually the problem. So in a way, these are just, it seems to be like the two big methodological themes that I'm working through. So I'm always happy to talk about open science.
I mean, that's a fun career, open science and theory formation. That sounds like a fantastic thing. I want to do both more and other things less, to be honest. I think that's both super, super exciting areas to work in, sort of the meta science of open science, meta psychology, and that is my doorbell. And theory formation. I'm in.
Yeah. I mean, it's the kind of thing that I wouldn't want to do full time. I think I want to have like a particular topic in question. I think it's the kind of thing I'm going to be very interested in, but probably from the outside. Anyway, there's one thing in the paper that maybe I'll read the part that made me think of the question. If the P factor is indeed a singular causal mechanism that explains comorbidity, the next logical steps may be to find P investigate its neurobiological basis and try to intervene on it. If instead P is a sensible and useful summary of the problems people tend to have, similar to SES, a useful formative construct that predicts mortality and morbidity, aiming to identify biological markers for P may make as much sense as trying to find the biological underpinnings of SES. This is because formative constructs are pragmatic summaries of data that can be useful but remain convenient fictions. So this is like a kind of a smaller part of what or a point you're making, but my question when I read that sentence or those two sentences was, how do I distinguish a convenient fiction from an actual phenomenon?
I mean, I guess it starts with the first step of being humble and acknowledging that the things we work with are convenient fictions. They're models, they're not theories. I guess that would be my take. And I think that would be a step forward if every researcher... So, okay, example. In my area, or not, in an adjacent area, people take diagnostic categories that in my field are known to be problematic. Low inter-rater reliability, low validity, all sorts of issues, measurement error. They take them, and because they're not from my area, they're from genetics, for example, they sort of unquestionably pretend these are true things in nature. They're like true zeros and true ones. Everybody with depression is a 1, everybody without is a 0. When we all, like in clinical psychology, it's pretty widely acknowledged that it's dimensional and a lot of folks are arbitrary. Do you include them, do you not include them? It's sort of on the edge. There's no true depression as a category. It's much more complicated than that. But if you then look for the genetic signal of depression by mistakenly pretending this is purely categorical and everybody with the 1 in your dataset really has true depression, the same way every gold atom has 87 protons, I think, and every non-gold atom has different number of protons. That's then you end up drawing inferences that just don't follow because you mistake convenient fictions, sometimes pragmatic, sometimes useful, sometimes not useful, for the truth, TM. And that leads you to trouble on the inference road in the end. So I think the first step, that's a bit prescriptive to say it like that, but I think we're working with a lot of convenient fictions, at least in clinical sciences. And I think it's good to be sort of, to be aware of that. And God knows clinicians are. A lot of the problems that my work has pointed out in clinical sciences applies to the way we do research on these diagnoses, for example. If you talk to clinicians, they will tell you, obviously, depression is not a true category in the universe. It's a convenient fiction that I require for healthcare services and can be useful sometimes for transferring patients, saying, the person has A and comorbid B to give them a rough impression. But every person is different. And of course, there's more information than this 0-1.
But isn't the hope of psychiatry to eventually find specific neuromechanisms that actually explain why people have, let's just say, certain problems? So isn't that kind of the inherent hope that there actually are real biological phenomena? So I guess my question is just like there's this weird in-between stage or something where at some point you have clear fictions and at some points you go, okay, I'm assuming this is some sort of neurotransmitter or whatever, and there's too much of it in the brain or too little or whatever. Or then you have stuff like the connectivity of, let's say, a brain area is whatever, not enough like a small world network or whatever, right? So it's a very like philosophical question, like when is something real and when is it just a construct?
Yeah, and it's an important question, definitely, and it's hard to navigate. I don't have a good answer. I think that there are a few fields in my area and my adjacent areas that have dominated the funding infrastructure so heavily, like neuroscience and genetics for mental health, with very little useful insights, or not useful, I don't want to say that, with very little actionable insights. There we have not developed any new drugs or, we can't help people better than 20 years ago with, if none of that funding would have happened. Doesn't mean it won't pay off in the long run, of course. That would be silly claiming that. But so far, actionable insights for the majority of the large mental health categories, mood disorders or anxiety disorders, that really hasn't contributed much. I think in part because we oversimplify things. And I don't know, it's a big discussion. Obviously, trivially, there will be neural mechanisms related to how people think, healthily or unhealthily, or that's how brains work. But if there's a clear relationship between the evidence so far shows that if we find aberrant mechanisms, they are often related to multiple mental health problems at the same time. They're sort of transdiagnostic in nature, which makes sense, I guess. And they have low specificity and sensitivity. And that means if I know, that you have this aberrant mechanism, it tells me very imprecisely about your mental health. It maybe helps me above chance level to predict anything, but maybe only 2% above chance level, and that means it's completely unactionable. It's like saying, I made an HIV test with you, and it's not a coin flip anymore. Now it's 52 to 48% that you have HIV. It's useless. It's on a population level, it might not be useless, but on any clinical implementation level, it's absolutely useless. Nobody would take that test because you would need to take it 30 times or maybe 50 times, to get any insights, and even then it would not be useful. So I'm a little skeptical.
But the criticism is that it's less actionable than current constructs, or because in some sense you could also say, right, it doesn't relate clearly to clinical diagnoses because those diagnoses aren't based on biological mechanisms, right? It can go either way almost.
Yes, and I think there's value in finding mechanisms that are not necessarily married to the current DSM. For example, there's this RDoc framework that tries to do this rather successfully at the moment, I think, and is worth supporting. I just think that a lot of these initiatives have been, so RDoc started with a paper in 2010 saying that all mental disorders are brain disorders, quote. I don't think that's helpful because it ignores environmental and psychological aspects that we know are really relevant for mental health problems. Are they going through the brain in some way? Yes, but they don't originate in the brain in some sense. So I just think we've been oversimplifying things for a little bit. Also psychologists. I had the huge honor and pleasure to sit in the same office as a sociologist during my PhD. Shout out to Roman. And yeah, I noticed how ridiculously little we take the environment into account in psychological research. So we're not better, or, I'm not better. I wish we would all work a bit more integrative.
Yeah. So is part of the solution just trying to be more aware of, I don't know, I guess it's like if you study something for years, it becomes a real thing, right? It feels like you forget that it's a construct, and it's just this friend or enemy of yours, depending on how you relate to it. But
yeah, there's lots of empirical work on the essentialist bias that, we work with constructs and then we think they're real to some degree, and adults do that, children do that, researchers do that. I don't know. I do that. Everybody does that. It's good to be reminded sometimes that we work with convenient fictions, at least at the construct level.
Yeah, the way you said that makes me wonder what you are. You said something like children do it, adults do it, researchers do it.
I do it.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, okay, what are you then if you're not one of those?
I just mean I'm not exempt. I'm not okay. A special category. It's just I in the paper, in the theory paper, I point at all the fingers, but the finger also points at me. I call out my own papers multiple times throughout this work. So I'm really writing this paper has been a huge learning thing for me, and I'm really not exempt from this criticism.
No, I think that's part of. I feel like one potential problem with writing these kind of critique papers of the field, however, it can always seem a bit condescending, or I know better than everyone else. And I think you navigated that very well by, not like self-flagellating the entire time, but like occasionally putting in a sentence or something saying like, in my papers, I also did this thing wrong, or this is a problem that I've made in the past, or something like that. I think that's a quite neat way of ensuring that, it doesn't look like Eiko comes here and tells everyone what to do, but it's more like this is a problem that everyone's working through.
Yeah, this stuff makes me sleep really badly, so I try to. You need to point fingers to some degree because other people say, well, but what evidence do you have? I hear so often these are just strawman arguments. Nobody really believes A, B, or C. So in the paper, I was sort of just required to say, here's a quote for A, here's a quote for B, here's a quote for C. This is not to call out these authors, as I say in the paper also. It's just to establish a baseline here that these things are being said and written and published. When they don't quite follow from the data, you just need to do that. But this stuff gives me headaches, and I reached out to quite a few of these authors and said, hey, just just so this is not it's not about you. It's just an empirical baseline, and God knows I've made these mistakes in my own work.
And the people understanding of this, or?
Yeah, I didn't have any over trouble so far, but of course these trouble are usually, behind your back. So I don't know.
I'll ask you again in 5 years.
I didn't get tenure because my boss got calls about my theory paper. No, I hope I'll be fine.
Yeah, I think that's the tone makes a huge difference. The tone with which you write, makes a big difference there. I don't know whether this is going to be whether you can comment a lot on this, but one thing it seems like whenever you read these papers that criticize theory in psychology, you come across, what's his first name? Meehl is his surname.
Paul Meehl, yeah.
Paul Meehl. It seems like he's always cited somewhere in there, and usually with the best quotes. I've read one, I think it was his paper, but I've heard him now. It seems like he's coming up now more than he used to in discussions about these things. Do you know much about him or what he did or anything? Or
I'm no Paul Meehl expert, but I've certainly read a few of his papers. I would strongly recommend all psychologists should read at least 3 or 4. He has, I think, 2 1978 papers. He has a 1990 paper. All 3 are highly cited, highly read. He writes extremely
which ones are those? I'll just put them in the description then.
1978, Theoretical Risks and Tabular Asterisks, The Slow Progress of Soft Psychology.
The 2 you're setting here is Appraising and Amending Theories, and Why Summaries of Research on Psychological Theories are often uninterpretable.
Yeah, and then the 1978 paper I just read out loud. These are 3 quite relevant ones, I think. So I was incorrect in saying 278, 190. It was 290, 178, but it doesn't matter. Yeah, so I think he was a clinical psychologist by training, actually, and a meta-psychologist. He thought a lot about how to theorize. He was a prominent critic of null hypothesis significance testing, an early prominent critic, and Perspectives on Psychological Science. The APS journal is publishing a special issue on Paul Meehl soon. I think most of the papers are online as preprints. Some of the papers are actually published in the journal, I think last week or 2 weeks ago. And we also wrote a paper on formalizing theories from sort of Paul Meehl's perspective, why the field is not doing it, how Meehl's criticism lends itself to this solution, why he never suggested it himself. I learned a lot from reading Paul Meehl. He's fun to read because he's very vocal. That's why the big sort of headline quotes are from Paul Meehl. He really didn't hold back. And there's I think it's on YouTube. There's a collection of his lectures, and I can highly recommend this if you like podcasts or if you like listening to stuff while you cook. There's a 10, 12, I forget, but that's online, and it's a fantastic resource to just get you thinking. He writes well, like Danny Borsbaum. Some people just write in a way that is entertaining, scathing, using examples in a way that helps you understand things that you really didn't get quite without these examples before. And that's why he also features in my paper quite prominently. Okay,
I'll put, as I said, links to all of that in the description. Okay, one thing. So this is something I talked about also with Paul Smordino, and I guess I'm going to ask you a fairly similar question here. And this is also something that you allude to you explicitly mention kind of at the end of your response to the responses, and you have a blog post about it, which is kind of, are we asking too much of psychologists? How are we supposed to learn everything? Because, I mean, I'm really not someone who is one for social reform or wants to tell people what to do or whatever. But when I read these things, I keep thinking why did no one tell me this? Shouldn't I have learned this during my bachelor's? With the caveat that I often didn't attend lectures. But, it feels like there's a lot of blind spots that are in the current curriculum and educational system for people who do psychology. So maybe I think the question, is maybe if we have to include something like how to maybe not create good theories, but at least distinguish weak from poor theories or something like that, or maybe a bit more mathematical stuff, a bit of modeling, what do we have to take out? Assuming we stick with a 3-year bachelor's.
What do we have to take out from the curriculum?
Yeah,
I really struggled with this as well in my basic emotion theories. No, I don't know. I had to learn. I honestly, I mean, I'm 38, so my education wasn't literally yesterday, but it was kind of yesterday in the history of the field, I would say. I had to learn a lot of theories by heart. I mean, theories, sort of weak theories by heart, summaries of things in personality or emotions, or even clinical. I needed to learn like the DSM stuff by heart and so forth, stuff that you can just read up on. So I think I spent a lot of time. I mean, honestly, I got into grad school because I had really good grades, because I just happened to be somebody who can learn things quickly and then forget about them after the exam. So it certainly was sort of helpful for my own career, but it didn't make me a better psychologist or researcher, having sort of been born with a fairly decent, like, shortish term memory for a couple of days. It's difficult. I grappled with this in the paper as well, saying, we want better stats education, we want better theory education, we want more interdisciplinary education. One solution, of course, is earlier specialization, but I think that's a very bad idea. There are specific bachelors already for clinical psychology, but I think it's been really helpful for me to have a sort of general psych bachelor, at least hear about cognitive psychology and personality and intelligence and so forth.
Yeah.
I certainly couldn't be a generalist today, or sort of a generalist, or aspire to be one if I had never learned about these adjacent areas that often face similar problems, by the way. I don't know. I would probably ask people to learn things less by heart and think more. But that's very general advice that
you'd keep the clinical stuff. For example, like one thing that Paul and I wondered about is whether it might be sensible to separate the two, because I did a straightforward bachelor of psychology, and as soon as anyone thought about saying the word math, half the room just fell apart mentally, especially in the examples of like a simple connectionist model, and people just didn't get it. I don't know what that really is to get, but I found like there were some cases where I felt like, these people are clearly interested in something very different than me. Should we even be in the same degree program here?
Yeah, I see that, especially for clinical psychology, of course, because a lot of people have a pretty clear idea that they might want to become a psychotherapist, for example. Maybe that can be a separate track. I don't know, here we have a research master's in clinical and we have a master's in clinical, like an applied master's to some degree, if you will. And the research master students more likely go into a PhD trajectory, and the more applied clinical master students more likely get their sort of registered opleiding psychotherapy education here in the Netherlands. But every university does it differently. I really struggle with this. I think here also we need plurality and just see how things work out best in different places. And I do think there's a place for specialization. We already have sort of statistical master programs in psychology. There are theory masters, or sort of theoretically, cognitive psychology does that quite a bit, for example. I'm not going to make the mistake again. I said in a talk 2.5 years ago that there is no theoretical psychology, and somebody said, I literally have a master's in theoretical psychology in the audience.
Really? Well, that's unusual. I didn't know that was either.
But it is unusual, but it happens. And part of my I feel stupid comes from working sufficiently across disciplines that I know that stuff exists I have no idea about. And that's been pretty humbling for me. I don't do it. I can't spell it, but I know it exists, and it makes me worried about the inferences from my work. Like the coordination problem, for example, I alluded to previously, like how does the sort of the true thing we try to measure relate to the observed thing that we measured? Is that linear, nonlinear, in which way? And it makes me worried anytime I measure anything now. And I haven't read up on this yet, but I know it exists, and it makes me worried and humbled about sort of this issue of trying to, measure anything in psychology. So there is some degree of benefit to teaching people a broader set of skills, or teaching them about different disciplines, or a broader set of problems. But there's also a benefit in having specialists who specialize in theory formation and specialize in math and so forth in psychology, and putting people together when we want to collaborate on something complicated. So I see both are valuable goals to some degree, and we need to find a good sweet spot between both, I think.
Yeah. I mean, one extreme example of specialization that I thought, this is not like a serious proposal I have, but something I thought might be something I've thought about occasionally for 5 seconds, is that because so I was reading a lot of these theory papers and I thought, like, did I actually learn anything during my bachelor's in psychology that's really useful for what I'm doing right now? And some, definitely, especially like writing. I had to write pretty much something every week that I had to hand in. So there's definitely some stuff I learned. But one thought I had was, like, why don't we just have, like, if you want to do research, you don't even have to study. You just do an apprenticeship in research. So you, like, I don't know, you do like your 16, 17 years of school, and then you just go into research. You are taught, I mean, of course, that's much more time intensive because you have to be taught by someone how to do it. But I don't know. I wonder whether what I would have missed had I not even studied, almost, in a way, but just, you know, I mean, that's I think maybe the way it often was in the past sometimes, right? When you hear, I can't remember, but I remember reading, no idea who it was, some chemist or something, who started off as, like, you know, not exactly sweeping the floor in the lab, but something like that, like in the 19th century, like really just working their way up. And then when they were 30, they could do their own experiments or something. I wonder whether that's worse.
Yes, I haven't heard about that idea before. I think, so when I was in Leuven in Belgium, during my first postdoc in a pretty technical quantitative psychology group with engineers and physicists, many of the technical people there held the belief that to do psychology, you should get a math bachelor's and then, like, do a 1-year psychology specialization, showing you how little they knew about psychology. Like, I really don't want to undervalue the importance of, like, what the field has done, all the clinical wisdom that is there, for example, in my area. Cognitive behavioral therapy and the theories around it, for example, has been hugely relevant and is hugely useful in helping people, and has nothing to do with statistics or math. Yeah, so it's hard to know the counterfactual, what I would know if I hadn't studied, and I think you pick up a lot of things on the way that you don't pay attention to. 2011-12, when I was in University of Michigan, Richard Dawkins gave a talk there about his new book. And after, in the Q&A, somebody asked him about the value of philosophy, and he said, like in his condescending tone, I never truly understood what philosophy is other than thinking clearly. And I thought, well, that's kind of important, Richard Dawkins. Like, thinking clearly is very, very hard. Humans are not sort of made to think clearly and unbiased. And so I think, if anything, I learned to think more clearly during my bachelor's in psychology, just by doing it. And that takes time, I think. And learning by doing.
Yeah, I also, like, as I said, like, this is not something I'm going to start a petition for anytime soon. But there's, like, all these other things, right? Like, you're, in my case, at least, living, I mean, I grew up in a small city, then moved to London. You live in a completely different place. That's, like, part of, being a student is also just all this, like, personal stuff, right? That I don't know to what extent you'd get that if you were in a lab with 3 people or whatever, rather than in a cohort of 150
So I'm a supervisor
people.
now. I supervise my undergraduate students on a daily basis. I'm not exaggerating. I realize how much I picked up from my prior mentors without them teaching me how to teach. I had so much luck with Danny and Francis and others along the road that I picked up all these implicit skills, and now I practice them explicitly, and I realize I do. I'm like, oh, Danny taught me that, sort of, although he never taught me in a sense. And so I think we pick up a lot of things on the way that we might not be aware of that are really useful down the road. And how to have an argument, how to be constructive in feedback, for example. Like, you just learn that, because if you're not, you get hit in the face in a metaphorical sense sometimes. So
I was about to ask whether that's from experience or
No. I might have said some things I regret, but I'm a very agreeable person in my personality structure, so I've deleted so many tweets because I'm like, oh no, maybe it's going to be misunderstood, and then I sleep badly, and I'd rather just delete it.
So no fistfights from your psychological arguments?
No, I do have I did Taekwondo for quite some time, but
maybe that's why. Like, before you criticize someone, you say, by the way, I know Taekwondo.
Exactly.
Yeah, but I think I wonder, like, in terms of, like, how much of a problem really, I mean, it definitely seems to me like a problem like that. in psychology, you learn lots of content, as you said, learning. I mean, I didn't have to do what you had to do with learning all the stuff by heart, but learning lots of content. And then, so I actually looked at the curriculum for my bachelor's, and it's roughly 60% content, 40% how to do experiments, more or less. But how to do experiments includes like analysis and that kind of stuff, right? But there's, nothing about theory in there at all. And at least I think we both agree that at least something should be in there to.
Yeah, Denny Borsbaum has this new paper in the Perspective special issue on the theory construction methodology or theory construction cycle. I think I featured that quite prominently in my rejoinder in this paper here that we talk about today. Just something basic like that is so helpful in structuring thoughts. How do we talk about theories all day, but how do we build them? How can we inform them? How do they help us learn something about the world? All that was new to me, and I sort of grappled with that by writing the paper and by learning about it, by making mistakes, by being called out in the commentaries for unclear use of nomenclature. So that, it's been a really nice learning experience, and I'm really grateful. I really mean that I had the privilege to engage with these brilliant thinkers and to be in the position to talk to Denny about this on a daily basis. For example, when I lived in Amsterdam and when I worked in Amsterdam, I remember I kept pestering Denny about statistical assumptions. I said, Denny, what about the multi-normality? And we were in the middle of a conversation, and Denny would just like leave my office. And I was like, where's he? He's this tall, impressive figure. He would just turn around and go, and I'm, what's happening here? And I would hear him walk down the hall, opening his office. You could hear the key. And then he came back, and then he dropped a book on my table, and it was like Against Methods by Paul, I think Feyerabend.
Yeah, I haven't read it, but great name.
Well, it says Darwin wasn't really a good methodologist, and Newton wasn't really the best in math, and so there are assumptions that you can bring to the table, but sometimes also just doing things might give you some insight. There's a bad summary of the book. You should read it. But anyway, lots of experiences with great mentors that helped me do things better down the road. And I didn't in that moment realize what I learned, but I realized it 2 years later or 5 years later.